with Sony relegating QD-OLED to a step-down model beneath the company's Mini LED flagship and therefore capping its peak brightness despite using Samsung Display's latest generation panel, there is little doubt in our mind that the Samsung S95F should be the brightest QD-OLED television on the market in terms of measurements. Indeed, a side-by-side comparison against last year's S95D using HDR test patterns and real-world content validated the S95F's higher peak brightness figures of 2200 nits on a 10% window in HDR filmmaker mode and almost 400 nits full screen. With its greater peak brightness headroom, the Samsung S95F was able to resolve the 4000 nit sun and surrounding clouds during this segment from pan in a clearer and brighter manner than the S95D. In this scene from Gemini Man, the clouds in the sky also looked punchier and more layered on the S95F, which came closer to matching the HDR presentation on the Sony BVM-HX3110 reference monitor. That said, it's worth pointing out that the generational improvements weren't as pronounced as what we saw between LG's G4 and G5, but that's largely because the S95D had set such a high bar, being capable of 90% BT 2020 and almost 1800 nits of HDR peak brightness, which meant that HDR titles graded to 1000 nits P3. And even the iconic flaming guitar scene from Mad Max Fury Road will already reproduce to a faithful enough degree. As we have come to expect from QD-OLED panels since launch, the PQ EOTF tracking on our S95F review unit was impressively accurate in HDR filmmaker mode out of the box, although near black detail looked somewhat darker than reference. Now, while you can increase the shadow detail setting to +2 to improve near black luminance tracking, unfortunately it would also lift the black floor however slightly. To be honest, we are not 100% opposed to this, since the Sony HX3110 and HX310 reference monitors would also emit the faintest glow anyway when displaying full screen black owing to their dual layer LCD backlight, and there's another reason to set shadow detail to +2, which we shall explain later in this video. Like all Samsung televisions we've tested, the S95F continued to adapt its tone curve to maximum display mastering luminance or max DML metadata rather than max CLL. But backed by its stronger light output, the roll of point had been set fairly high, so HDR titles which have been graded conservatively in a 4000 nit container would still be presented with adequate brightness. One minor drawback of such a high roll-off point regardless of max CLL metadata is that once in a while, very bright highlight detail can appear blown out, sometimes with visible discoloration stemming from clipping in individual color channels. Even though lowering the contrast value can help mitigate the clipping, it also compromises EOTF tracking by darkening the overall image too much, so it's not a viable solution. While Kalman AutoCal support wasn't available on the S95F during our review period, Samsung has implemented a couple of welcome improvements in the picture menu to make manual calibration easier. 1. You can now adjust the size and transparency of the user menu, helpful for reducing the risk of the on-screen UI affecting measurements or triggering ABL. And 2. The last 5 settings you've used are now pinned to the top of the main menu, making it much quicker to access them directly without having to navigate through the submenus repeatedly. With this out of the way, SDR color accuracy was good on our 65-inch review sample after a quick and simple 2-point white balance calibration, with only some minor inaccuracies exceeding the humanly perceptible threshold of delta error 3 in this challenging color checker SG chart, something most viewers are highly unlikely to notice without a side-by-side comparison against a reference display. Unfortunately, trying to obtain accurate HDR colors was less plain sailing on our review unit. The good news is that unlike on the 83-inch S95F featuring a 4-stack WOLED panel, the color space auto setting in non-game picture presets, including HDR filmmaker mode on the 65-inch QD-OLED, still defaults to the REC 2020 color gamut option, which allowed for almost 91% BT 2020 coverage in UV terms. The bad news is that the baseline color luminance with color space left at the factory default setting of auto was far too dark, causing the red bar sign in this scene from Blade Runner 2049, which doesn't even exceed 200 nits P3, to look radically different from the presentation on a Sony HX3110 reference monitor. We tried using the onboard color management system or CMS to address this issue, but the adjustments required were so drastic that they introduced posterization and slightly reduced the color gamut coverage to the mid-80s. In the end, we simply opted for the color space normal setting, which delivered the overall most accurate colors out of all the available options, without the need for further tinkering. Given the immense color potential of QD-OLED, we sincerely hope that Samsung can release a future firmware update to improve the S95F's HDR color accuracy, much like how last year's S95D became impressively accurate after a series of firmware refinements. As with the Samsung S95C and S95D following their respective firmware updates, motion handling remains arguably the Achilles heel of the S95F. Yes, even with picture clarity disabled, the TV correctly applied 5.5 pull-down to present slow panning shots in 24 frames per second movies accurately without telesonic judder. However, occasionally there would be a brief moment of motion hiccup, especially when there's a significant luminance jump between scenes, most noticeable when a black screen is followed immediately by a slow-moving shot. This artifact isn't easy to spot in a compressed 24p YouTube video, so for better visibility, I've captured this slow-motion footage where last year's S95D also seemed to suffer from the same issue. Interestingly, changing the luminance or contrast at the TV level could either increase or reduce the frequency of this issue, which is partly why we did not object to setting shadow detail to +2. That said, the only surefire method to kill this erratic motion processing is by switching to game or PC mode, but then you would have to contend with telesonic judder since 5.5 pull-down would be deactivated too, as well as a less refined picture. Furthermore, the motion processor on the Samsung S95F appeared to have a mind of its own when dealing with 50Hz material we get in the United Kingdom and other PAL countries. On the latest firmware of 1023 at the time we filmed this video in April 2025, engaging the picture clarity setting, even with judder reduction set to 0, would introduce unmistakable soap opera effect or SOE and interpolation artifacts to 25 frames per second content within a 50Hz container. The inclusion of the more powerful NQ4 AI Gen 3 processor has enabled the Samsung S95F to perform more advanced video processing than what we observed on last year's S95D. The S95F's more aggressive upscaling produced a sharper image across most standard def and high-definition broadcasts we watched with minimal side effects, though it can exaggerate mosquito noise in lower quality material. Even native 4K UHD content looked that bit crisper, attributable to a small dose of dynamic microcontrast enhancement under the hood despite sharpness being set to 0 in HDR filmmaker mode, as evident from increased moire on the Luma zoom plate pattern in UHD SDR. In all fairness, Sony and more recently LG have adopted similar approaches, which, while not always appreciated by purists, have been well received by general consumers, making it understandable that Samsung would follow the trend. If you are absolutely hell-bent on disabling the always active microcontrast enhancement, one workaround is by switching to game mode, but be forewarned, the drop-off in image quality is really stark. One notable improvement brought about by the NQ4 AI Gen 3 processor is the enhanced performance of the decontouring filter bundled in the noise reduction setting. While the difference was negligible in brighter content, the Samsung S95F demonstrated a clear advantage in heavily compressed, low-light scenes. With noise reduction set to standard, the S95F was able to smooth out the posterization more effectively than the S95D, resulting in cleaner gradients without excessive softening. Of course, most video enthusiasts, including myself, would very much prefer if the decontouring filter were decoupled from the noise reduction setting, which could scrub away film grain and fine detail. Perhaps that's something for Samsung engineers to consider for next year's model. Otherwise, like every Samsung TV we've reviewed before, overscan still cannot be disabled in standard definition resolution on the S95F. For example, on this SMPTE RP133 test card in 576i, leading to a more zoomed in and slightly softer standard def presentation. Although the TV correctly detected and processed 3:2 cadence in film-based interlaced material, it struggled to maintain consistent lock on 2:2 cadence, which is far more common in the UK and other PAL regions, even with film mode enabled. And from time to time, jaggy suppression in video-based interlaced material would go awry in filmmaker mode without any obvious cause, requiring manual intervention, such as switching to another picture preset and back again to resolve the issue. Bottom line is, always try to send a high-definition progressive video signal to the TV for the best picture quality. Thanks to its top emission design, QD-OLED displays such as the Samsung S95F deliver the best bright uniformity and viewing angles on the market today. Our 65-inch review unit manifested no banding, dirty screen effect or color tinting on full-field gray slides, even when viewed from extreme angles. That said, our sample did not perform as well in dark uniformity test, with several vertical bands visible not only on full-field near black slides, but also in challenging low-light scenes such as this one from Mulholland Drive. Of course, this may be isolated to our particular unit, but if more reports of poor dark uniformity surface, it raises the question of whether the issue could be linked to the new 5-stack architecture of the latest generation QD-OLED panels. With game mode engaged, input lag measured 9.5 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, halving to under 5 milliseconds at 120 FPS, which is as responsive as you can get on a consumer television for playing fast action games. One unique selling point of Samsung OLEDs is the provision of a Game Motion Plus setting, which lets users deploy frame interpolation in game mode to achieve a smoother gaming experience when playing, for example, 30 FPS games. Even with Game Motion Plus set to level 2, which applied the strongest interpolation, input lag did not go beyond 22 milliseconds, which is still a reasonably responsive figure. 4 HDMI 2.1 ports are provided, each offering 40 instead of the full 48 gigabits per second of HDMI 2.1 bandwidth, which is a limitation of the One Connect box. Nevertheless, we did not experience any signal loss or blackouts even at 4K 165Hz in HDR VRR throughout our review period, since the Samsung S95F supports 24 gigabits per second of DSC or display stream compression as well. With Game HDR left at the default setting of Basic, HGIG implementation on the S95F was better than on last year's S95D, yielding a more accurate PQ EOTF tracking out of the box on our 65-inch review unit, which hard-clipped at the TV's panel peak of 2200 nits for both maximum tone map luminance and maximum full-frame tone map luminance, paving the way for a remarkably impactful HDR experience in HGIG-compliant games. We spotted some minor clipping of bright highlight detail during actual gameplay, possibly caused by the slightly over-brightened EOTF tracking at the top end, so we lowered the contrast value by 1 click. Man, look at all these cars overtaking me. I hope you appreciate the sacrifice I've made to film this video. I hate finishing last. Just like in other non-game modes, HDR color accuracy in game mode wasn't ideal, especially given that the most accurate original game genre preset isn't available when HGIG is enabled. However, taking into account QD-OLED's superior native 10-bit gradation and higher color luminance, which benefit HDR games that are typically full screen and take advantage of Rec 2020 colors, we believe the Samsung S95F is the TV to beat for HDR gaming this year. Similar to all consumer televisions we've tested, some VRR flicker was inevitable in a handful of VRR games during more sedate scenes and on static menus. While the Samsung S95F doesn't support Dolby Vision and therefore can't run games in Dolby Vision, it's hardly an issue. Most Dolby Vision TVs almost always suffer from noticeably over-brightened PQ EOTF tracking in Dolby Vision game mode by default, and native Dolby Vision game titles remain limited. The latest glare-free 2.0 coating on the S95F suppressed reflections even more effectively than on last year's S95D, softening edge outlines to reduce visual distractions. Now, while we did not observe any major improvement in ambient contrast, aside from a slight shift in tint, the new anti-glare filter on the S95F showed less stray light artifacts. This was evident in our measurements of a black square positioned directly next to a white one in a 4x4 ANSI checkerboard pattern. Our colorimetry research CR100 colorimeter returned a reading of 0.001 nits on the S95F versus a brighter 0.005 nits on the S95D, indicating that the 2025 model should exhibit less blooming or light scatter effect around bright highlights against dark backgrounds. Despite its blacks turning grey when hit by direct light, the super effective anti-glare filter will work for some people better than a reflective TV in certain viewing environments. The 70-watt 4.2.2 speakers on the Samsung S95F sounded slightly better than that on the outgoing S95D, with decent dialogue clarity, soundstage, volume and body once you engage the amplify function, which we consider a must. Nonetheless, bass and presence remain lacking, possibly due to the ultra-slim chassis, so it's worth budgeting for an external soundbar or home theater system if an immersive and punchy listening experience matters to you. Let's sum up. The Samsung S95F is right up there as one of the best TVs you can buy this year when it comes to picture quality, delivering several key upgrades over last year's S95D, such as higher peak brightness thanks to the latest gen QD-OLED panel from Samsung Display, noticeably sharper upscaling and improved handling of low bitrate material courtesy of the more powerful NQ4 AI Gen 3 processor, more accurate PQ EOTF tracking in game mode with HIG Engage, 4K 165Hz support for PC gaming, as well as the second-gen anti-glare coating which suppresses reflections and light scatter in an even more effective manner. And when you add to the equation all the picture quality attributes we've come to like so much about QD-OLED technology, such as class-leading bright uniformity, cleaner near-black handling without chrominance overshoot or flashing artifacts, wide viewing angles without off-axis tinting, as well as rich color saturation that won't be diluted by high brightness, the Samsung S95F receives our highly recommended award. Of course, no TV is perfect, and the Samsung S95F's superior QD-OLED panel hardware was let down somewhat in software by quirky motion processing and relatively inaccurate HDR colors. Some potential TV buyers will lament the continued absence of Dolby Vision support, though it can be argued that the benefits of the premium dynamic metadata HDR format diminish on TVs with higher peak brightness which require less help with tone mapping. Some will also be put off by the S95F's matte screen, but genuinely, the non-glossy finish is of a markedly higher quality, not the Vaseline-like, slightly grainy version implemented on lesser displays. And in a pitch-black room, a matte screen in itself shouldn't look different from a glossier panel anyway. If you are undecided about which TV to buy, one place where you can get good advice is at Richer Sounds, a trusted British AV retailer with more than 50 stores in the UK, who provides 6 years warranty on the vast majority of TVs if you join the company's VIP club. You will get the best deals through cheaper VIP exclusive in-store only prices, complimentary gifts or freebies, so go visit your local Richer Sounds store or call telesales for your next TV purchase. Thanks again for your support. Okay, while the 55 and 77-inch versions of the Samsung S95F use a QD-OLED panel, just like the 65-inch model we reviewed, the largest 83-inch variant is equipped with a different 4-stack WOLED panel from LG Display. For more detail on the differences in color accuracy and performance, please watch our technical first look video by clicking here.